The blood was already seeping through his white gloves when the colonel arrived, but that wasn't the disturbing part. Trooper Nathan Bell had just been struck by a taser from an American SWAT officer, yet he sat perfectly still on his horse, saber unmoving. He'd served multiple tours in Afghanistan and bore a shrapnel scar, but none of that was visible to the crowd. Phones captured every second as tourists whispered in shock. When Colonel Lowry lifted Bell's scorched uniform and spoke those 4 words, "This is now a sovereign-level incident," the true horror became clear. Some lines should never be crossed. If that gave you chills, make sure to like the video and subscribe for more gripping stories just like this. And hey, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments. I'd love to know how far this story is reaching. The crowd stood frozen as whispers spread through the gathered tourists, but none of them understood what they had just witnessed. Children pointed excitedly at the mounted guard, who remained perfectly still despite the chaos that had just unfolded around him. Parents fumbled with their phones trying to capture something they couldn't quite comprehend. The autumn afternoon light cast long shadows across the ceremonial grounds where Trooper Nathan Bell sat motionless on his horse, his scarlet uniform bearing the unmistakable marks of what had just occurred. Bell's posture remained flawless, even as dark stains spread across the white fabric of his gloves. His ceremonial saber caught the light as it rested against his shoulder, not a tremor visible in his grip despite the electrical shock that had coursed through his body moments before. The crowd's initial excitement began to shift as they noticed details that didn't belong in their holiday photos. Scorch marks traced jagged patterns across his red tunic where the taser prongs had made contact. His breathing remained controlled and measured, but those close enough could see the slight tension in his jaw that betrayed the pain he was enduring in silence. What the tourists couldn't know was that Bell had served multiple tours in Afghanistan and carried a shrapnel scar from his service. This wasn't his first encounter with pain or adversity. A security officer near the perimeter lowered his radio and stared at the scene with growing alarm. This wasn't the kind of incident that happened during routine ceremonial duties. The American SWAT officer who had delivered the shock stood nearby, his confident expression beginning to waver as he realized Bell's response wasn't what he had expected. Tourists who had been laughing and taking selfies just minutes before now watched with uncomfortable uncertainty. The blood seeping through Bell's white gloves became more noticeable as the minutes passed. His horse shifted slightly beneath him, but Bell's hands remained steady on the reins. Not once did his saber waver from its ceremonial position. The crowd began to murmur among themselves, their voices carrying a new tone of concern as they recognized that something serious had occurred before their eyes. A uniformed officer approached the security perimeter and spoke quietly into his radio. His words carried the weight of escalation as he described the scene to his superiors. The incident was no longer contained to the immediate area. Protocol demanded that higher authorities be notified when a member of the ceremonial guard was assaulted while on duty. Bell absorbed the shock and remained mounted. His responses to the security personnel checking on him were brief and measured. When asked if he could continue his duties, his single-word answer of yes carried no emotion, no complaint, no request for assistance. His voice remained steady despite the visible evidence of what he had endured. Only after protocol arrived would he be assessed and taken for medical attention. The SWAT officer had expected drama, reaction, perhaps anger or retaliation. Instead, he found himself facing something far more unnerving than any aggressive response. Bell's stone-like composure in the face of unprovoked assault created a silence that seemed to condemn the attacker more effectively than any shouting match could have accomplished. The crowd sensed this shift in power dynamics even if they couldn't articulate what they were witnessing. Security personnel moved with increasing urgency as the scope of the incident became clear. This wasn't a prank or publicity stunt that could be dismissed with warnings and paperwork. The assault of a ceremonial guard represented something more serious, something that required immediate attention from military authorities rather than civilian security forces. Palace staff triggered an unscheduled diplomatic alert, and the Royal Military Police were called. The words "ceremonial guard assaulted while on duty" carried weight that transcended normal security concerns. Protocol kicked in with mechanical precision as the situation escalated beyond local management. What happened next would demonstrate the difference between individual endurance and institutional authority. The sound of military vehicles approaching could be heard in the distance, their engines carrying a different kind of urgency than civilian emergency services. The crowd began to realize they were about to witness something far more significant than a simple security incident. Official authority figures were arriving, and their presence would transform this moment of individual courage into something much larger. The crisp sound of military boots on cobblestone announced Captain Hannah Rhee's arrival. She stepped from the lead vehicle with measured precision, her uniform bearing no creases, her bearing carrying no hurry. Yet her presence immediately commanded attention from everyone present. Behind her, 3 members of the Royal Military Police moved in formation, their approach creating a stark contrast to the earlier chaos. Rhee's eyes swept the scene with professional assessment, taking in the mounted guard who remained perfectly still despite his obvious injuries, the American SWAT officer who now looked far less confident, and the crowd of tourists whose excited chatter had given way to nervous whispers. Her gaze lingered on the scorch marks visible on Bell's uniform and the blood that continued to seep through his white gloves. The taser dart had struck Bell's thigh below his cuirass, leaving visible evidence of the assault. A corporal stepped forward and delivered his command with clarity that left no room for interpretation. "Step away from the guard and place your weapons on the ground." His voice carried authority without aggression, the words settling over the scene with unmistakable weight. The SWAT officer straightened his shoulders and adjusted his tactical vest, clearly preparing to assert his authority over what he still believed was his scene to control. His confidence remained intact even as the Royal Military Police formed a precise perimeter around Bell's position. The tactical gear that had made him appear formidable now seemed out of place against the backdrop of ceremonial tradition. Captain Rhee moved through the crowd with quiet efficiency, positioning her team to establish clear lines of authority while maintaining respect for the ceremonial space. She approached Bell's horse with the clinical assessment of someone who had seen enough combat zones to recognize discipline maintained despite significant pain. "Are you capable of continuing your post?" she asked Bell, her voice carrying professional concern rather than emotion. Bell's single-word response of yes came without hesitation, his voice steady despite the visible evidence of what he had endured. Rhee nodded once, then turned her attention to securing the Americans. Her team demonstrated how proper protocol could impose order without creating additional drama. Their movements were economical and purposeful, each position serving a specific function in establishing British military authority over the ceremonial space. The tourists began to understand they were witnessing something far more serious than they had anticipated. Phones lowered slightly as excited commentary gave way to hushed observations. The laughter that had filled the air minutes before stopped entirely as the gravity of the situation became clear. The SWAT officer's growing realization that his authority meant nothing on Crown property became evident in his increasingly defensive posture. His earlier swagger faded as he encountered institutional power that operated by different rules than those he was accustomed to wielding. He found himself surrounded by personnel who answered to different chains of command and operated under protocols he didn't understand. Bell remained motionless throughout this display of institutional authority, his discipline serving as a silent reminder of what had precipitated this response. The contrast between his quiet endurance and the professional efficiency of the Royal Military Police created a powerful narrative about individual courage supported by systemic authority. Rhee's controlled presence shifted the power dynamic from chaos back to order in ways that were both subtle and unmistakable. Her approach demonstrated how proper military bearing could impose structure on a situation without unnecessary force or dramatic gestures. The moment when British military authority reasserted control over the ceremonial space was marked not by confrontation, but by the simple reality that legitimate institutional power had arrived. The sound of another approaching vehicle, this one carrying insignia that commanded even greater respect, announced that a higher level of authority was about to arrive on the scene. The engine's distinctive sound carried a different kind of weight, suggesting that what had already been a serious incident was about to become something far more significant. Colonel James Lowry emerged from the vehicle with measured steps that carried the weight of decades in service. His uniform denoted senior rank, and his approach was unhurried yet purposeful, each movement reflecting the confidence of someone who had spent years making decisions that mattered. Unlike the earlier arrivals who had focused on crowd control and establishing perimeters, Lowry moved directly toward Bell with the bearing of someone accustomed to getting to the heart of complex situations. The colonel's arrival signaled an immediate shift in the gravity of the situation that even the tourists could sense. Captain Rhee stepped aside with visible relief, her professional demeanor acknowledging that this was now beyond her level of authority to handle. The Royal Military Police maintained their positions, but deferred to Lowry's presence as he approached the mounted guard, who had remained motionless throughout the escalating response around him. Lowry walked past the security barriers without acknowledgement, his focus entirely on Bell. He removed his gloves with deliberate precision, then carefully lifted the lower portion of Bell's ceremonial breeches to expose the damage beneath. The crowd fell silent as a clear scorch mark became visible against Bell's skin, the electrical burn creating stark evidence of what had occurred. The colonel examined the damage for exactly 3 seconds, then nodded. His trained assessment cataloged what others might miss or dismiss, but his examination was thorough and respectful, recognizing that Bell was still on duty and deserved to be treated with the dignity his service had earned. The contrast between his calm methodology and the earlier chaos created by the SWAT officer's aggression was stark and unmistakable. Tourists who had been taking photos and videos suddenly understood they had captured something far more serious than they had realized. Parents pulled their children closer as the true extent of Bell's injuries became apparent through Lowry's careful examination. The festive atmosphere that had surrounded the ceremonial grounds earlier gave way to an uncomfortable awareness that they were witnessing the aftermath of something that should never have occurred. The colonel's inspection demonstrated how true authority operated through competence rather than intimidation. His quiet professionalism stood in sharp contrast to the dramatic displays of force that had characterized the initial incident. Bell remained perfectly still throughout the examination, his discipline allowing Lowry to complete his assessment without interference or complaint. Building toward his declaration, Lowry stepped back and surveyed the scene with the full weight of his institutional authority. The SWAT officer who had seemed so confident earlier now faced someone whose judgment carried consequences that extended far beyond the immediate moment. The crowd sensed that something significant was about to be declared as the colonel prepared to deliver his assessment of what had transpired. Lowry's declaration cut through the afternoon air with surgical precision. This is now a sovereign-level incident. His voice carried no emotion, no anger, simply the weight of institutional authority making an official determination about the nature of what had occurred. The words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples that would extend far beyond the ceremonial grounds. Those 4 simple words elevated this from a local disturbance to a matter of state, transforming everything that would follow. The colonel's declaration carried implications that reached into diplomatic channels, military protocols, and international relationships that most of the gathered crowd could barely comprehend, but somehow understood were monumentally important. The SWAT officer shifted his weight slightly, his tactical gear suddenly seeming less impressive against the backdrop of institutional authority that had just been invoked. His earlier confidence began to show the first signs of uncertainty as he processed what the colonel's words meant for his position. The crowd watched as the power dynamic shifted once again, this time in ways that would prove far more consequential than anything that had come before. Lieutenant Carl Rains stepped forward with the desperate confidence of someone playing his final card. His voice carried the rehearsed authority of someone accustomed to having his credentials open doors and close, uncomfortable conversations. The words came out in a rush as he attempted to invoke protections that had served him well in other contexts, but might prove meaningless here. His training had prepared him for many scenarios, but none had involved explaining his actions to a British colonel on Crown property after assaulting a ceremonial guard. "I have diplomatic immunity," Rains declared, his earlier swagger now replaced by the nervous energy of someone who suddenly understood that the rules he thought applied might not exist in this space. The tactical vest that had made him appear formidable now seemed inadequate against the backdrop of institutional authority that surrounded him. His claims of legitimacy clashed against the immovable force of British sovereignty over Crown property like waves breaking against granite cliffs. Rains invoked his status as part of a US tactical exchange program with the desperation of someone who understood that his career and freedom might depend on the recognition of credentials that suddenly seemed inadequate. His voice carried undertones of panic as he insisted that authorities would need to contact Washington to verify his legitimacy and resolve what he characterized as a diplomatic misunderstanding. The confidence that had driven him to assault a ceremonial guard now transformed into the frantic energy of someone who realized he had miscalculated the consequences of his actions. The lieutenant's desperate attempts to minimize the incident revealed how quickly confidence could transform into damage control when faced with consequences. His words tumbled out in careful phrases designed to reduce his actions to misunderstandings rather than deliberate assault. The language of military bureaucracy that had served him well in after-action reports now sounded hollow against the visual evidence of Bell's injuries and the silent testimony of the mounted guard's continued discipline. A corporal stepped forward with measured authority. "Place your weapons in our hands, sir." The request carried no aggression, simply the weight of procedure being followed with professional precision. Rains hesitated, his hand moving instinctively toward his tactical gear before compliance overcame resistance. Each item was tagged, cataloged, and removed with methodical efficiency that demonstrated how proper protocol could impose order without drama. The crowd watched this systematic dismantling of Rains' authority with uncomfortable fascination. His earlier arrogance underwent a complete transformation as the situation spiraled beyond his control in ways he had not anticipated. The tactical superiority he had felt when delivering electrical shock to an apparently helpless target now seemed like a distant memory as he faced institutional authority that operated by different rules. Colonel Lowry's response cut through diplomatic pretensions with surgical precision that left no room for interpretation or negotiation. His years of experience dealing with personnel who confused authority with license had prepared him for exactly this type of encounter. The colonel's voice carried the weight of institutional judgment as he prepared to deliver an assessment that would strip away the protective layers Rains had built around his actions. "Your diplomatic status is irrelevant here," Lowry declared with the finality of institutional judgment rendered by someone who understood the difference between legitimate authority and empty posturing. His words carried no emotion, simply the crushing weight of reality delivered to someone who had confused credentials with character. The declaration stripped away every protection and justification Rains had attempted to invoke, leaving him exposed to the consequences of his actions without the shield of immunity he had assumed would protect him. The lieutenant's world collapsed in real time as the crowd witnessed power without accountability, meeting true authority grounded in service and sacrifice. His desperate claims faded into irrelevance against the measured response of institutional dignity that had arrived to restore order to the ceremonial grounds. In the distance, the sound of approaching vehicles carried a different quality than the military transports that had arrived earlier. These engines moved with unhurried precision, their approach suggesting that an even higher level of authority was about to make its presence known. 5 motorcycle outriders appeared first along the ceremonial approach, followed by 2 maroon Rolls-Royce limousines that moved with deliberate calm. Their polished surfaces reflected the autumn afternoon light as they approached the gates where Bell maintained his post despite his injuries. No flashing lights announced their arrival. No urgent horns demanded immediate attention. The vehicles simply materialized with the quiet authority that comes from centuries of understanding how real power operates when it chooses to make itself known. The Royal Convoy's arrival created a visual counterpoint to the earlier chaos that had erupted around the ceremonial grounds. Where Lieutenant Rains had brought tactical aggression and dramatic confrontation, the royal vehicles brought measured composure and institutional dignity. Their approach demonstrated how controlled authority presents itself when faced with situations that demand careful handling rather than explosive response. The convoy's patient waiting at the ceremonial gates became a test of institutional resolve. The lead vehicle stopped precisely at the designated point and remained there without any sign of impatience or urgency. No officials emerged to demand explanations or immediate action. The vehicles simply waited with the kind of patience that suggests absolute confidence in the eventual outcome. Their stillness created a pressure far more intense than any aggressive demand could have generated. The vehicle's complete lack of urgency created an almost meditative quality to the pressure building around the situation. No sirens wailed to announce the importance of their occupants. No flashing lights demanded immediate attention from the gathering crowd. The convoy's silence spoke louder than any dramatic display of authority could have managed. Their quiet presence suggested that those inside possessed the kind of confidence that comes from knowing that time worked in their favor rather than against it. Tourists and onlookers began to understand they were witnessing a strategic display of royal dignity that operated by rules completely different from anything they had observed earlier. The crowd's whispered conversations carried new tones of respect and recognition as they realized the vehicles contained individuals whose very presence elevated the significance of what had occurred. Phones continued to record, but the excited commentary gave way to hushed observations about witnessing history unfold in real time. The royals' silent observation from within their vehicles demonstrated that true leverage often comes from timing and restraint rather than immediate action. Their choice to remain present but not interfere sent messages that penetrated far deeper than any public statement could have achieved. The convoy's occupants understood that their mere presence transformed the situation from a local incident into something with far broader implications for everyone involved. This measured response contrasted sharply with the earlier displays of force and aggression. Where Rains had chosen confrontation and dramatic action, the royal response emphasized patience and dignified presence. The convoy's approach revealed how institutional authority could apply pressure through restraint rather than through displays of power that might escalate situations beyond useful boundaries. The convoy's non-interference stance became a masterclass in applying pressure through principled waiting that allowed events to unfold according to proper protocols. Their decision to observe rather than intervene demonstrated confidence in the military and police personnel already handling the situation. The royal presence elevated the stakes without creating additional complications that might interfere with the professional response already underway. Colonel Lowry and his team continued their work with the knowledge that their actions were being observed by individuals whose judgment would carry weight far beyond the immediate consequences facing Lieutenant Rains. The convoy's silent vigil created accountability that extended up through the highest levels of British institutional authority. The realization settled over everyone present that the palace's response strategy involved demonstrating strength through disciplined restraint rather than through dramatic confrontation. Their approach revealed how true institutional authority maintains its standards without compromising its dignity through unnecessary displays of force or emotion. The convoy would not pass through the gates until the situation was properly addressed, their patient presence serving as a reminder that some standards cannot be compromised regardless of diplomatic pressure or international complications. Their waiting had become part of the resolution itself, a demonstration that certain traditions would endure whatever challenges they faced. Moments later, Trooper Singh approached from the guardhouse, his polished boots striking the cobblestones with measured precision. His red uniform bore the same pristine appearance that Bell had maintained despite everything that had occurred over the past hour. The crowd that had witnessed chaos and confrontation now prepared to observe something far more profound than they could have anticipated when they arrived to watch what they thought would be routine pageantry. The ceremonial handover from Trooper Bell to Trooper Singh began to demonstrate the continuity of duty that transcends individual circumstances or external threats. Singh moved with the same disciplined bearing that had characterized Bell's service throughout the afternoon's ordeal. His approach created no drama, demanded no special attention, simply fulfilled the requirements of ceremonial protocol that had governed this post for generations. The transition represented institutional memory made manifest through individual commitment to standards that remained unchanged regardless of what had attempted to disrupt them. The precision of the guard change became a powerful statement about institutional resilience that operated beyond the reach of those who would challenge its authority. Singh positioned himself at the exact distance required by ceremonial protocol, his movements economical and purposeful as he prepared to assume responsibility for the post that Bell had defended through extraordinary circumstances. The crowd watched with growing appreciation as they recognized they were witnessing something that transcended mere military procedure to become a demonstration of unbreakable institutional continuity. The mirror formation of the handoff unfolded with the silent precision that preserved the ceremony's dignity while acknowledging the extraordinary nature of what had preceded it. Singh's salute was crisp and respectful, Bell's response equally precise despite the visible evidence of his ordeal. Their synchronized movements created a ballet of duty that spoke more eloquently about the nature of service than any speech could have accomplished. The exchange of responsibilities occurred as if nothing had happened, the discipline continuing without acknowledgement of the drama that had surrounded Bell's tenure at the post. Bell dismounted with the same controlled precision that had characterized every moment of his watch. His posture remained perfect as medical personnel approached with a privacy screen, their movements efficient and respectful. The blood on his gloves had dried. The scorch marks on his uniform remained visible. Yet his bearing suggested nothing more than the completion of routine duties. His cooperation with the medical assessment carried the same dignity that had characterized his response to every challenge he had faced during his watch. The quiet testimony of his scorched uniform told the story of what he had endured without breaking under pressure that would have overwhelmed most individuals. The electrical burns visible through the fabric served as permanent evidence of his commitment to duty even when faced with unprovoked assault. His injuries spoke louder than any dramatic declaration could have managed, creating a visual record of courage that transformed him from a ceremonial figure into a symbol of institutional strength. The absence of dramatic ritual heightened the realism of what the crowd witnessed and demonstrated that true discipline is practiced rather than performed for public consumption. No speeches marked the transition. No ceremonies acknowledged Bell's extraordinary service during his watch. The handover proceeded according to protocols established long before this day and destined to continue long after everyone present had forgotten the specific details of what they had observed. Singh's assumption of the post proved that the ceremonial guard existed beyond any single individual, however courageous or dedicated that person might prove to be. The institution's strength lay not in dramatic responses to crisis, but in its ability to maintain standards regardless of external pressure. The crowd's shift from spectacle to reverence marked their recognition of witnessing something more profound than entertainment or tourist attraction. As Bell disappeared behind the privacy screen for medical assessment, the crowd began to disperse, unaware that the real consequences of what they had witnessed were only beginning to unfold through channels that operated far from their view. Behind the ceremonial grounds, a different kind of justice was being delivered through channels that operated with mechanical precision. The diplomatic machinery that had remained silent during the public confrontation now engaged with the systematic response that characterizes institutional authority when ceremonial sovereignty faces direct challenge. Official channels opened between military and diplomatic offices as the incident that had begun with one man's misguided attempt to demonstrate authority generated consequences that would extend far beyond the ceremonial grounds where it had occurred. The diplomatic consequences that followed the assault demonstrated how institutional integrity extends beyond the immediate scene to encompass relationships and agreements that span continents. The assault on Trooper Bell had violated more than ceremonial protocol. It had breached international agreements governing the conduct of foreign military personnel on British sovereign territory. The paperwork generated by these communications would create a permanent record of institutional failure that would follow Lieutenant Rains throughout whatever remained of his military career. Within 24 hours, exchange status was revoked, and the Americans were escorted off Crown property. His name was struck from training rosters, his security clearances were flagged for review, and his participation in future international programs was terminated with immediate effect. The efficiency with which these administrative actions occurred revealed how seriously institutional authorities regarded threats to ceremonial dignity. What had taken Rains seconds to execute would require years for him to overcome, if such recovery proved possible at all. The directive declaring the entire SWAT unit persona non grata on Crown property arrived through official channels with language that left no room for interpretation or appeal. Rains and his colleagues found themselves no longer welcome on any Crown property, their tactical credentials rendered meaningless against the authority of institutional sovereignty. The escort that accompanied their departure was professional but unmistakably final, ensuring that their exit carried the weight of official sanction rather than mere administrative convenience. This decisive boundary setting sent a clear message about the cost of threatening ceremonial sovereignty that resonated through military and diplomatic circles far beyond London. Allied nations took note of how swiftly and thoroughly the British response had isolated those responsible for the assault. The incident became a case study in institutional consequence that would influence future training protocols and international exchange agreements. Military personnel serving abroad would learn of Bell's steadfastness and Rains' disgrace as complementary lessons about honor and accountability. The revelation emerged that authority is exercised not by the loudest voice or most dramatic action, but by those who possess the institutional capability to enforce standards without spectacle or fanfare. Rains had mistaken noise for power, aggression for authority, but discovered that true institutional strength operates through quiet competence rather than theatrical display. His career trajectory shifted permanently downward, while Bell's reputation grew stronger through his refusal to abandon his post under assault. The palace's response proved that power without disciplined restraint loses its legitimacy when tested against institutions that understand the relationship between service and authority. Royal displeasure expressed itself through systematic exclusion rather than dramatic confrontation. The convoy that had waited silently during the immediate aftermath of the assault had observed everything necessary to ensure appropriate consequences followed. Their patience had been strategic rather than passive, allowing events to unfold in ways that created clear accountability for all parties involved. Bell's response to assault had demonstrated the kind of strength that institutions value and protect. His willingness to endure rather than retaliate had created moral authority that no amount of tactical training could replicate or overcome. The administrative consequences that followed revealed how institutional power operates through measured response rather than immediate retaliation. The tourists who had witnessed these events began to understand they had observed something that transcended ordinary concepts of ceremony or entertainment. Their phones had captured more than holiday memories. The crowd left quieter, changed by witnessing discipline hold against provocation that would have broken lesser spirits. They had come seeking entertainment but discovered something far more valuable than spectacle. Bell's response taught them that real power doesn't announce itself with noise or dramatic gestures. True strength operates through presence that endures when everything else falls away. Authority lives in stillness when faced with aggression, proving that discipline isn't performance designed for cameras, but character tested under fire. Which would you choose when pushed to your breaking point? Fight back or refuse to break? Tell us why in the comments below, and if this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe for more untold stories of courage.